In the spring of the 1960s, as the Cold War entered its most dangerous and sophisticated phase, a Soviet playwright and journalist named Yuri Krotkov quietly stepped out of the world he had helped build. He was not a tank commander or a rocket designer. He was a man of words, a dramatist, a scriptwriter, a storyteller. But in the Soviet Union, words were weapons, and Krotkov had spent years using his talent for language in the service of the KGB. When he finally defected to the West, he did not bring blueprints for missiles or technical manuals for radar systems. He brought something just as important in the long run, an insider's account of how the Soviet state manufactured lies to destabilize democracies, poison public opinion, and wage a quiet war against the very idea of truth. To understand why Yuri Krotkov mattered, you have to picture the world he came from. Born in Tbilisi in 1913 and educated in literature at Moscow University, he entered adulthood in a state where art and politics were fused together. As a young writer and journalist, he worked for TASS, the Soviet news agency, and Radio Moscow. Those were not neutral institutions. They were the voice of the Soviet state. Every sentence he wrote, every script he produced, was expected to serve the cause of socialism. During and after the Second World War, he was sent to Berlin, not just as a journalist, but as a KGB information officer, someone who reported on the mood, the conversations, and the vulnerabilities of people around him. In the immediate post-war years, Moscow had a problem. The Soviet Union had won a colossal victory over Nazi Germany, but it had also inherited a devastated economy and a reputation abroad that was far from uniformly positive. Western publics remembered not only Soviet heroism at Stalingrad, but also Stalin's pact with Hitler in 1939, the brutal Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, and the show trials and purges of the 1930s. As the Iron Curtain descended, the Kremlin understood that it faced not just a military and economic competition with the United States, but an information war. In that war, people like Yuri Krotkov were ammunition. By the early 1950s, Krotkov had returned to Moscow and remade himself as a screenwriter and dramatist, but his link to the KGB never broke. He became what the KGB called a co-opted worker, an outside professional they could use when needed. His code name, Suliko, evoked his Georgian roots. His tasks were not what most Westerners imagine when they think of spies. He was not stealing NATO war plans. He was helping to build and execute compromat operations, compromising material campaigns that fused seduction, blackmail, rumor, and disinformation into potent weapons. One of the most telling episodes in Krotkov's KGB career revolved around a French diplomat, Ambassador Maurice Dijon. In the 1950s, the French ambassador in Moscow and his wife became targets in a carefully orchestrated honey trap operation. The KGB understood that diplomats were human beings first, representatives of their governments second. They had weaknesses, desires, and blind spots. Using codename Suliko, Krotkov was tasked to seduce Dijon's wife, while female KGB operatives targeted the ambassador himself. The goal was simple: gather enough compromising material that Paris would be forced to listen when Moscow whispered that certain policies might be unwise. This kind of operation was not just about sexual embarrassment, it was about shaping decisions. If a Western ambassador knew that photographs or recordings could be leaked, he would choose his battles more carefully. He might argue less forcefully for a tough line on Berlin. He might soften his criticism of Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe. He might push his own government to understand Soviet concerns. That is disinformation at the personal level, using lies and half-truths about a private life to influence public decisions. Krotkov's role in the Dijon operation taught him exactly how far the KGB would go to get leverage over a Western official.
But the KGB's ambitions went far beyond individual diplomats. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, as television spread, as newspapers reached more people, as radio broadcasts crossed borders, the Soviet leadership began to think bigger. It was not enough to influence a few ambassadors or trade negotiators. The target was the entire atmosphere of opinion within Western democracies. If you could make large numbers of people doubt their own institutions, if you could amplify every scandal and division, if you could paint the United States as a dangerous, warmongering, hypocritical power, you could sap the will of those societies to resist Soviet pressure. Inside the KGB, this strategy was called active measures. It was a mixture of forgeries, planted stories, rumor campaigns, front organizations, and recruited journalists. And this is where Krotkov's experience as a writer and his later testimony become crucial. Unlike many spies who saw only one small piece of the machinery, Krotkov saw how the propaganda, the theater, and the intelligence operations fit together. He understood that a forged document without a believable narrative was just a piece of paper. To do real damage, the KGB needed storytellers. Throughout the 1950s, Moscow's propaganda machine ran at full speed alongside its security operations. Radio Moscow and other state outlets broadcast carefully curated messages to foreign audiences. Articles appeared in sympathetic newspapers around the world, some in communist or fellow traveler press, others in seemingly independent outlets whose editors or correspondents had quietly agreed to act as amplifiers for Soviet narratives. Some of these journalists were ideological allies, others were cynics. Still others, if you believe Krotkov's later claims, were closer to controlled assets. One of Krotkov's most controversial allegations after his defection was that certain well-known Western correspondents, such as the Australian journalist Wilfrid Burchett, were essentially working on the KGB side of the information war. Burchett had reported from places like North Korea and Vietnam in a style that echoed Soviet narratives about American biological warfare and imperial aggression. To Krotkov, this was not just misguided journalism, it was the fruit of conscious cultivation by Soviet services. In his telling, KGB officers tracked, appreciated, and quietly supported such voices, knowing that their reporting could shape how millions of people understood conflicts in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. For a long time, Western publics did not know this. They read headlines and watched TV clips that showed their own governments criticized by ostensibly independent voices and assumed that this was simply part of a healthy democratic debate. And in many cases, it was. Democratic societies do produce real criticism. But Krotkov's testimony later forced Western audiences and policymakers to confront a more uncomfortable possibility, that some of what looked like organic dissent was in fact being carefully fed, framed, and magnified by a hostile foreign power.
By the early 1960s, the technological balance of the Cold War had become impossible for Soviet elites to ignore. The United States had not only deployed nuclear weapons and long-range bombers, it had also built a vast communications and computing infrastructure. Mainframe computers hummed in American corporations, universities, and government agencies. Television networks brought live images into living rooms. New printing technologies allowed faster and wider circulation of newspapers and magazines. For a writer like Krotkov, who had grown up in a state that controlled every printing press and broadcasting studio, the scale and speed of Western information flows were both impressive and alarming. Inside the Kremlin, that technological dynamism was seen through a lens of fear. Soviet leaders did not look at American communications networks and see an opportunity for cooperation. They saw channels through which American ideas and culture could seep into their own society and erode ideological control. They saw an adversary whose ability to project narratives and images around the world far outstripped their own.
and they responded in the only way a closed system knew how, with more secrecy at home and more disinformation abroad. It was in this context that Yuri Krotkov made his break. While on a trip to London as part of a Soviet group, he slipped away and sought asylum. British intelligence debriefed him extensively. They were interested in the details of his honey trap operations, in his knowledge of specific KGB officers and methods. But they were just as interested in his description of the KGB's disinformation worldview, how they identified targets, how they forged documents, how they planted stories in friendly media, and how they evaluated success. For several years, Krotkov remained largely a British asset, not a public figure. But by the late 1960s, his name surfaced in the United States. In 1969, after initial reluctance, U.S. authorities allowed him to enter the country so that he could testify before a Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. In that testimony, he laid out what he had seen and done. He described the Dijon affair. He named journalists he believed had knowingly or unknowingly served Soviet ends. He spoke about the KGB's view that the press in free societies could be used as a weapon against those very societies. For an American audience in that era, still reeling from the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and internal divisions, there was something both chilling and clarifying about Krotkov's claims. On one hand, it was disturbing to think that foreign intelligence services might have had a hand in shaping debates that Americans thought were entirely homegrown. On the other hand, his testimony highlighted a strength that the Soviet system could never match: the ability of a democracy to absorb even these uncomfortable revelations, investigate them in public, and continue forward. Inside the KGB and other Western services, Krotkov's case became part of a broader internal struggle. Some counterintelligence officers, influenced by other defectors like Anatoly Golitsyn, began to suspect that any Soviet defector who spoke in detail about disinformation might himself be part of a deeper deception, a monster plot, intended to tie Western agencies in knots by feeding them a mix of truth and falsehood. Was Krotkov a truth-teller or a tool? Was his account a sincere attempt to expose Soviet crimes, or a carefully crafted story meant to discredit real allies of the West by labeling them KGB puppets? That very debate, however, underlined the key difference between the two systems. In the Soviet Union, such questions could never be asked openly. Doubting the party line could land you in prison. In Washington and London, intelligence services and congressional committees argued openly about how much weight to give Krotkov's testimony. Journalists reported on his claims and on the pushback. Citizens could read, think, and decide for themselves. In information warfare, openness is risky, but it is also resilient. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the KGB continued to invest in disinformation and active measures. Studies by defectors and researchers like Ladislav Bittman would later detail how Soviet services forged State Department documents, invented secret NATO plans to destabilize peace movements, fabricated evidence of Western war crimes, and then laundered these forgeries into the global media stream through sympathetic newspapers or front organizations. Once a story appeared in a foreign newspaper, Radio Moscow could quote it as Western reporting, lending Soviet propaganda a borrowed legitimacy. Yuri Krotkov's life after defection reflected his dual nature as both witness and artist. He wrote works such as The Red Monarch, Scenes from the Life of Stalin, blending dramatized scenes with an insider's feel for the atmosphere of Soviet power and propaganda. He moved through literary and journalistic circles in the West, sometimes embraced, sometimes regarded with suspicion. He was not always a tidy, sober witness. His accounts could be colorful, even gossipy. That very messiness made him more human and also more controversial. For an American audience today, looking back on Krotkov's story, several threads stand out. First, the Soviet state's reliance on disinformation was not a sign of strength, but of weakness. A regime confident in its own legitimacy and performance does not need to forge documents and fabricate scandals abroad. The Soviet Union, unable to compete with the United States in open technological innovation and economic performance, tried to close the gap by manipulating perception. It attacked the reputation of its adversaries instead of fixing its own flaws.
Second, the very tools the KGB tried to weaponize, the openness of Western media, the freedom of journalists, the willingness of societies to criticize themselves, also became the channels through which Soviet disinformation was ultimately exposed. Defectors like Krotkov spoke publicly. Researchers combed through archives. Journalists investigated both Soviet operations and their own profession's vulnerabilities. Congress held hearings. Books were published. The record, while imperfect, grew clearer over time. Third, Krotkov's journey embodies a pattern that runs through the Cold War. Whether they were rocket scientists, bioweapons experts, secret police officers, or disinformation operatives, Soviet insiders who crossed to the West tended to tell a similar story. They had come to realize that the system they served could not reconcile its hunger for control with the realities of a modern, information-rich world. They had seen up close the dynamism of a freer society. They had watched as American and Western technology leaped ahead in computing, communications, and industrial capacity. They had also watched as their own leaders responded not by reforming, but by building more elaborate structures of lies. In the end, the information war that Krotkov helped wage on one side and expose on the other did not save the Soviet system. No amount of forged documents or planted stories could compensate for stagnant factories, censored science, and a crippled public sphere. The United States, for all its mistakes and internal conflicts, continued to produce new technologies, new ideas, and new voices. Its media sometimes amplified falsehoods, but it also had the capacity to self-correct, to bring new facts to light, to challenge its own assumptions. When Americans learn about defectors like Yuri Krotkov, they are not just hearing spy stories, they are seeing, in human form, the difference between two ways of organizing a society. In one, information is a state monopoly. Truth is whatever the leadership says it is, and disinformation is a core tool of policy. In the other, information is messy, contested, and often chaotic, but that very chaos allows lies to be challenged and truth to emerge over time. Krotkov's life is a reminder that the Cold War was not only a contest of bombs and rockets, it was a contest of narratives, of whose story about the world would prove more compelling and more durable. The Soviet Union tried to undermine Western confidence with rumor and forgery. The United States beat it by building a society where people could see, think, argue, invent, and defect toward the light.